The morning sun painted the Yokohama shipyard in golden light as Keela walked through the massive gates. She had done this walk thousands of times, but today felt different. The sound of metal hitting metal rang through the air like a song her family had been singing for almost 100 years. Her boots clanked against the steel walkways as she made her way to the construction site. Around her, workers moved like dancers in a carefully planned show. Everyone knew their part. Everyone had their place. This was how it had always been in the Nakamura family business. Keela stopped at the edge of Platform 7, where the newest cargo ship was taking shape. The vessel stretched out before her like a sleeping giant. In a few months, this ship would carry containers across the Pacific Ocean. It would bring toys from China to children in California. It would carry coffee beans from South America to cafes in Tokyo, but right now, it was just steel and dreams. She pulled out her tablet and checked the morning reports. Everything was on schedule. The welding teams had finished Section C overnight. The electrical crew would start their work on Deck 3 after lunch. Her father had trained her well. She could read these reports like other people read newspapers. But as she stood there, watching the sparks fly from the welding stations below, her mind began to wander. She thought about all the cargo this ship would carry. But what about the people who loaded those containers? What about the families who made those toys? What about the farmers who grew that coffee? Her great-grandfather had started this company with nothing but strong hands and big dreams. He had worked 16-hour days to build his first small fishing boat. During the war, her grandfather had helped rebuild Japan's merchant fleet. Her father had turned their small business into one of the most respected shipyards in Asia. Now it was her turn. At 28, she was already one of the youngest chief engineers in the industry. She had a doctorate from Tokyo University. She could calculate stress loads in her sleep. She could design a ship that would last 50 years in the roughest seas. But lately, something felt missing. The feeling had started small, like a tiny leak in a ship's hull. At first she had ignored it, but over the past few months it had grown stronger. Every time she watched a ship leave the harbor, she wondered about the human stories it carried. Ships were not just metal boxes that moved from place to place. They connected people. They brought families together. They carried hope across vast oceans. Yet here she was, focused only on the engineering side. She knew everything about hull design and engine efficiency, but she knew very little about the people whose lives these ships touched. The sound of footsteps on the metal stairs made her look up. Her father was climbing toward her platform, carrying his usual morning coffee and wearing his lucky hard hat. The hat was old and scratched, but he refused to replace it. He said it had seen too many successful launches to retire now. "Good morning, daughter," he said in Japanese, then switched to English. "How are our numbers looking today?" "Everything is perfect, father," she replied, handing him the tablet. "We are actually 2 days ahead of schedule." He smiled with pride. This was the Nakamura way. Always on time. Always perfect. Always professional. But as he reviewed the numbers, Keela found herself studying his face. Her father had spent his entire life building ships. He could tell you the exact weight of every bolt, the strength of every weld. But when was the last time he had thought about the people who would use these ships? "Father," she said carefully, "do you ever wonder about the families who travel on our ships?" He looked up from the tablet, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we spend months building these vessels. We test every system. We check every detail. But we never think about the human side. We never consider how our ships affect people's lives." Her father set down his coffee and looked at her with concern. In their family, work was work. Personal feelings stayed at home. This kind of thinking was new territory. "Keela, our job is to build safe, efficient ships. That is how we serve people. That is how we honor our family name." She nodded, understanding his point, but the feeling in her chest would not go away. Later that morning, she was conducting a routine safety inspection on Deck 5 when she met someone who would change everything. A woman in a wetsuit was taking water samples near the ship's hull. She had long black hair tied back in a practical ponytail and carried a waterproof case full of scientific equipment. "Excuse me," Keela called out in English. "You should not be in this area without safety clearance." The woman looked up and smiled. "Oh, sorry about that. I am Maria Santos from the Marine Biology Institute. We have permission to collect samples here. I am studying how shipping traffic affects whale migration patterns." Keela had never thought about whales and ships before. She climbed down to the water level to talk with Maria. "Well," she asked, "how do our ships affect whales?" Maria's eyes lit up. She clearly loved talking about her work. "Well, these large vessels create underwater noise that can confuse whales. They use sound to navigate and communicate. Imagine trying to talk to your family in a room full of loud music. As Maria explained her research, Keela found herself fascinated. Here was someone who looked at ships from a completely different angle. Maria did not care about engine efficiency or cargo capacity. She cared about how these massive structures affected living creatures. The whales have been using these ocean routes for thousands of years, Maria continued. But now they have to share them with container ships, tankers, and cruise vessels. Some whale families get separated because they cannot hear each other over the ship noise. Keela felt something shift inside her chest. She had spent her entire career thinking about ships as machines, but Maria was talking about them as neighbors in a shared ocean community. That evening, Keela sat in her small apartment overlooking Tokyo Bay. Through her window, she could see the lights of cargo ships moving in and out of the harbor. Each light represented tons of cargo, millions of dollars in trade, thousands of jobs. But now she also saw something else. She saw whale families trying to stay together in increasingly noisy waters. She saw fishing communities whose traditional grounds had become shipping highways. She saw port cities struggling with air pollution from massive diesel engines. For the first time in her life, Keela began to question whether building better ships was enough. What if there was more she could do? What if she could find a way to connect the human side with the engineering side? The next few weeks passed in a blur of normal work activities, but inside her mind a new kind of blueprint was taking shape. She began to imagine what it would be like to study people the way she studied metal stress points. Could she learn to design human connections the way she designed ship hulls? The idea seemed crazy. Her family had built their reputation on precision engineering, not social experiments, but the feeling would not go away. Every day it grew stronger. Standing once again on Platform 7, watching another ship take shape, Keela made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew her. She was going to test something completely different, something human. The conversation with her father did not go well. Keela sat across from him in his office, surrounded by ship models and engineering awards that told the story of their family's success. She had practiced her words carefully, but nothing could have prepared her for the look of complete confusion on his face. "You want to do what?" he asked, setting down his teacup with shaking hands. "I want to take a break from the shipyard to study people," she repeated slowly. "I want to learn about human psychology and community building." Her father stared at her as if she had just announced plans to become a circus performer. In his world, people did not abandon successful careers to chase strange ideas, especially not people named Nakamura. "Keela, you are 28 years old. You have a brilliant future here. Why would you throw that away for ... for what, exactly?" She tried to explain about Maria and the whales, about the families affected by their ships, about her growing feeling that engineering alone was not enough. But with each word, her father's expression grew more worried. "This is not how we do things," he said finally. "We build ships, good ships. That is our contribution to the world." That night, Keela walked the streets of Tokyo until her feet hurt. Neon signs reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. Office workers hurried past, heading home after long days. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged except her. She found herself standing outside Tokyo University, where she had earned her engineering degree 6 years earlier. The campus looked different at night, quieter and more mysterious. On impulse, she walked to the library and spent hours reading about psychology programs. The more she read, the more excited she became. There were entire fields of study dedicated to understanding how people connect with each other. Researchers spent their lives figuring out how to build trust, resolve conflicts, and create strong communities. It was like discovering a whole new type of engineering. 3 weeks later, despite her family's protests, Keela enrolled in a graduate program in social psychology. Her engineering colleagues thought she had lost her mind. Her childhood friends stopped calling. Even her mother, who usually supported her decisions, seemed confused. "I just do not understand," her mother said during one of their weekly dinners. "You had everything figured out. Why make life so complicated?" But Keela was discovering that complexity could be beautiful. Her first psychology class opened her eyes to ideas she had never considered. The professor, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a sharp mind, talked about human behavior the way Keela's engineering professors had talked about physics. "People follow patterns just like water or electricity," the professor explained. "But human patterns are much more interesting because they can change." Keela found herself taking notes frantically, trying to capture every insight. She learned about cognitive biases, social dynamics, and the psychology of trust. Each concept felt like a new tool she could use to build something important. Her engineering background actually helped in unexpected ways. While other students struggled with research methods and data analysis, Keela approached psychological studies with the same systematic thinking she used for ship design. She could spot patterns in human behavior the way she spotted stress points in metal structures. But the real test came when she decided to volunteer at a refugee resettlement center in downtown Tokyo. This was where theory would meet reality. The center occupied an old office building that had been converted into temporary housing and support services. The hallways smelled like different types of cooking, and children's voices echoed from the common areas. Keela had never been in a place quite like it. Her supervisor was a tired-looking social worker named Hiroshi who had been helping refugees for over a decade. He seemed skeptical when Keela introduced herself as an engineer studying psychology. "We need people who understand trauma and loss," he said bluntly, "not people who think human problems can be solved like math equations." Keela wanted to argue, but she decided to prove herself through actions instead of words. Her first assignment was helping newly arrived families fill out paperwork for government services. The forms were complicated and confusing, even for people who spoke perfect Japanese. For families who had fled their home countries with nothing but hope, the bureaucracy felt overwhelming. Keela watched as parents struggled to explain their children's medical histories in a foreign language. She saw teenagers trying to translate for their grandparents while dealing with their own fear and uncertainty. She witnessed the exhaustion in people's eyes as they faced yet another pile of forms. At first, she approached the problem like an engineer. She created flowcharts to simplify the paperwork process. She developed checklists to help families gather the right documents. She even designed a simple translation guide for the most common forms. These improvements helped, but Keela quickly realized that efficiency was only part of the solution. The families needed more than streamlined paperwork. They needed someone to listen to their stories. They needed to feel welcomed and valued, not just processed. One evening, she was helping an elderly Afghan man named Ahmed fill out a housing application. His hands shook as he tried to write his address from 20 years ago, before he had fled his country. Suddenly he stopped writing and looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I used to build houses," he said in broken English. "Beautiful houses with gardens. Now I live in one small room and fill out papers all day." Keela felt something break open in her chest. This was not about forms or efficiency. This was about human dignity. Ahmed was not just a refugee who needed housing, he was a craftsman who had lost everything but still carried decades of knowledge and skill. "Tell me about the houses you built," she said, setting aside the paperwork. For the next hour, Ahmed described the traditional architecture of his hometown. His eyes lit up as he talked about courtyards designed to catch morning light and thick walls that kept homes cool in summer heat. Keela found herself thinking about structural engineering, but also about how spaces could make people feel safe and connected. That conversation changed everything for her. She began to understand that her engineering skills were just tools. The real challenge was figuring out what to build, and increasingly, she believed that what the world needed most was not better ships, but better ways for people to support each other. Her grades in psychology classes were excellent, but more importantly, she was developing a new way of seeing problems. Instead of asking, "How can I make this more efficient?" she started asking, "How can I make this more human?" The families at the refugee center became her teachers. They showed her how communities could form even in the most difficult circumstances. They demonstrated the power of shared meals, storytelling, and small acts of kindness. But they also revealed the gaps in existing support systems. Services were scattered across different agencies. Information was hard to find. Most importantly, there was no real effort to help people rebuild the social connections that had been broken. When they left their home countries, Keela began to see refugee resettlement the way she saw ship construction. There were multiple systems that needed to work together. There were stress points where everything could break down, and there were opportunities to design something better. Late at night, in her small apartment, she started sketching ideas. Not blueprints for ships, but diagrams of how human services could be connected more effectively. She imagined community centers that felt like neighborhoods. She designed support programs that honored people's existing skills while helping them adapt to new circumstances. Her family still did not understand her choices, but Keela was beginning to understand something important about herself. She was still an engineer. She still loved solving complex problems and building things that lasted. She was just building something different now. 6 months into her psychology studies, Keela made a discovery that changed everything. She was sitting in the refugee center's common room, watching two groups of families who barely spoke to each other, when the idea hit her like lightning. On one side of the room sat families from Afghanistan who had arrived 3 months earlier. On the other side sat families from Myanmar who had been there for almost a year. Both groups needed the same things. Both groups faced similar challenges. But they stayed separate, like two ships passing in the night. The problem was not language, though that was part of it. The real issue was competition. There were only so many job training spots, only so many good apartments, only so many volunteer tutors for the children. Each group saw the other as rivals for limited resources. Keela pulled out her notebook and started drawing, but instead of ship blueprints, she drew something she called a community map. She sketched the different families as nodes in a network. She marked the resources they needed and the skills they already had. Then she looked for patterns. What she saw amazed her. Ahmed, the elderly man who used to build houses, had carpentry skills that could help Tin, a young father from Myanmar, who was struggling to find work. Meanwhile, Tin's wife Maya was a former teacher who could help Ahmad's granddaughter with her homework. The families were not competing for the same resources. They were potential resources for each other. The next week, Keela tried something that had never been done at the center before. She organized what she called a skills exchange dinner. Instead of separate mealtimes for different groups, she arranged one big dinner where families could share food and talk about what they were good at. Her supervisor, Hiroshi, was skeptical. "These groups have been here for months," he said. "If they wanted to interact, they would have done it already." But Keela had learned something important from her engineering background. Sometimes the problem is not that people do not want to connect. Sometimes the problem is that there is no structure to help them connect safely. She spent days planning the dinner like she used to plan ship launches. She arranged the tables so families from different countries would sit together naturally. She prepared conversation cards with simple questions in multiple languages. She even coordinated the food, so each family brought something that could be shared easily. The night of the dinner, Keela was nervous. What if her idea failed? What if the families just sat silently and went home early? For the first 30 minutes, it looked like her fears might come true. People were polite but distant. Conversation stayed small and careful. Children hid behind their parents. Then something magical happened. Ahmed's 10-year-old grandson was struggling with a math problem. For school, Maya, the former teacher from Myanmar, noticed and offered to help. As she worked through the problem with the boy, other children gathered around. Soon she was helping kids from both groups with their homework. Meanwhile, Ahmad started examining a broken chair in the common room. Tin watched for a few minutes, then offered to help. Within an hour, they were deep in conversation about different woodworking techniques, communicating through gestures and simple English words. By the end of the evening, families were exchanging phone numbers and making plans to help each other. Ahmed agreed to teach Tin's older son basic carpentry. Maya offered to tutor several children in math and English. Other connections formed around cooking, sewing, and job search strategies. Keela watched it all happen with a feeling she had never experienced before. This was better than watching a ship launch. This was watching people launch new relationships that could change their lives. Word of the successful dinner spread quickly through the refugee center. Other social workers wanted to know how Keela had made it work. She tried to explain her approach, but it was difficult to put into words. Finally, she started calling it social engineering. Just like building a ship, you had to understand the materials you were working with. You had to identify the stress points where things might break. You had to design structures that could handle unexpected pressures, but instead of steel and electronics, she was working with trust and communication. Instead of engines and navigation systems, she was building networks of mutual support. Her success at the refugee center led to unexpected opportunities. A local community college asked her to help solve conflicts between different student groups. A technology company wanted her advice on improving workplace teamwork. Even the city government reached out about urban planning challenges. Each project taught her something new about human behavior. She learned that people often fought not because they disliked each other but because they felt scared or misunderstood. She discovered that small changes in how spaces were organized could dramatically improve how people interacted. At the technology company, she solved a major conflict between the engineering team and the marketing team by changing how they held meetings. Instead of sitting on opposite sides of a conference table like opposing armies, she arranged chairs in a circle where everyone could see each other as equals. The simple change transformed their discussions. Engineers started understanding customer concerns better. Marketing people gained appreciation for technical challenges. Within 2 months, the company was launching products faster and with fewer problems. But not everyone was impressed with her methods. Traditional social workers questioned whether an engineer could really understand human complexity. They worried that her systematic approach was too cold and mechanical for dealing with people's emotions. Humans are not machines, one veteran counselor told her during a conference. You cannot just redesign them like you would redesign a car engine. Keela understood the concern, but she disagreed with the assumption. She was not trying to change people. She was trying to change the environments and systems that made it hard for people to connect naturally. Her biggest test came when the refugee center faced a crisis that threatened to undo all her progress. A new group of families arrived from Somalia, and tensions immediately arose with the existing communities. Resources were stretched thinner than ever. Families who had been working together started competing again. Some people blamed Keela. Integration programs, they said, bringing different groups together had created false expectations. Maybe it was better to keep communities separate to avoid conflict, but Keela saw the problem differently. The issue was not too much integration. The issue was that the support systems had not grown to match the larger community. She spent weeks analyzing the situation like she would analyze a structural engineering problem. Where were the weak points? What resources were being used inefficiently? How could the load be distributed more evenly? Her solution was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of having one big refugee center trying to serve everyone, she proposed creating smaller neighborhood hubs where different communities could maintain their cultural identity while sharing certain resources. Each hub would specialize in different services. One might focus on job training and business development. Another might emphasize education and childcare. A third could handle housing and health services. Families could access all the hubs, but they would have a home base that felt culturally comfortable. The proposal was radical. It required coordination between multiple agencies and significant changes in how services were delivered. Many officials thought it was too complicated to work, but Keela had learned to present her ideas the way she used to present ship designs. She created detailed plans showing how the hub system would improve efficiency while reducing costs. She demonstrated how shared resources could actually serve more people better than the current centralized approach. Most importantly, she had evidence from her smaller experiments. The skills exchange dinners had evolved into weekly community meetings. The homework tutoring had grown into a full educational support program. People were already proving that her approach worked. 6 months later, the first neighborhood hub opened in a converted warehouse near the original refugee center. It felt more like a community center than a government office. There were spaces for children to play while parents attended meetings. There were kitchens where families could cook traditional foods together. There were workshop areas where people like Ahmad could teach their skills to others. The hub system was not perfect. There were still conflicts and challenges, but something fundamental had changed. Instead of seeing themselves as temporary refugees waiting for help, people began seeing themselves as community members, building something together. Keela realized that she had not abandoned her family's tradition of building ships. She had just learned to build a different kind of vessel. These were ships that carried people not across oceans, but across the distances that separated them from each other. The earthquake struck at 2:47 on a Friday afternoon. Keela was in the middle of a meeting with city officials about expanding the neighborhood hub program when the ground began to shake. At first it felt like a truck passing by. Then the shaking grew stronger. Papers fell from desks. Coffee cups slid across tables. People grabbed onto chairs as the building swayed back and forth. When the shaking finally stopped, everyone sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then phones started ringing all at once. The earthquake had hit the Tohoku region hard. Early reports mentioned damaged buildings, power outages, and transportation problems. But it would be hours before anyone understood the true scale of the disaster. Keela's first thought was about her family's shipyard. She tried calling her father, but the phone lines were jammed. Text messages were not going through either. All she could do was wait and worry. By evening, the news was devastating. The earthquake had triggered a tsunami that destroyed entire coastal communities. Thousands of people were missing. Among the damaged facilities was the Nakamura shipyard, where her father and dozens of workers had been when the waves hit. Keela caught the first train that was running toward Yokohama. The journey that normally took 2 hours stretched to 8 because of track damage and safety checks. During the long ride, she stared out the window at a landscape that looked like a war zone. When she finally reached the shipyard, she found her father standing in what used to be the main office building. Half the roof had collapsed. The construction platforms where new ships had been taking shape were twisted metal and debris. But her father was alive, and so were all the workers. They had evacuated to higher ground when the tsunami warnings came. The shipyard could be rebuilt. The most important things were safe. "I am so glad you came," her father said, hugging her tightly. "We need all the help we can get." For a moment, Keela felt pulled back into her old life. This was where she belonged, helping rebuild the family business. But as they walked through the damaged shipyard, she noticed something that her engineering background had not prepared her to see. The workers were not just dealing with broken machinery and flooded buildings. They were dealing with trauma and loss. Some had lost their homes in the tsunami. Others were worried about family members in the affected areas. Everyone was struggling with the psychological impact of watching their workplace get destroyed in minutes. Meanwhile, news from the refugee communities was equally troubling. Many of the families she had been working with were now facing a double displacement. They had fled their home countries, rebuilt their lives in Japan, and now found themselves in emergency shelters again. The neighborhood hubs she had helped create were being used as evacuation centers, but they were overcrowded and chaotic. The careful community structures she had built were falling apart under the pressure of crisis. Keela realized she was facing the ultimate test of everything she had learned. Could her ideas about human connection and community building work during a real emergency? Or would people only cooperate when times were easy? That night, as she sat in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, she had an idea that seemed crazy but might just work. What if she could combine both her worlds? What if she could use her family's shipbuilding expertise together with her knowledge of human psychology to create something entirely new? The next morning, she presented her idea to her father and his business partners. Several cargo ships in the harbor had been damaged by the tsunami but were still structurally sound. Instead of scrapping them or making expensive repairs for commercial use, what if they converted them into temporary floating communities for displaced families? The men looked at her as if she had suggested building spaceships. "Keela," her father said gently, "cargo ships are not designed for people to live in. They do not have proper sleeping areas or kitchens or bathrooms." "But they could," she replied, spreading her sketches across the conference table. "We have the engineering expertise to modify them safely, and I have learned how to design spaces that help people cope with trauma and build community." Her proposal was radical. She wanted to transform the cargo holds into family apartments. She planned to convert deck space into common areas where people could cook, socialize, and support each other. Most importantly, she wanted to organize the ship communities using everything she had learned about helping displaced people connect and heal. The idea faced resistance from multiple directions. Government officials worried about safety regulations and liability issues. Traditional social workers questioned whether ships were appropriate housing for trauma survivors. Even some shipping industry experts doubted whether cargo vessels could be converted for human habitation. But Keela had learned to build coalitions, the same way she had learned to build ships. She identified allies and addressed concerns systematically. Maria, her marine biologist friend, provided research about successful floating communities in other parts of the world. Ahmad and other refugee community leaders vouched for her understanding of displacement and trauma. Her psychology professors offered to help design therapeutic programs for the ship communities. Most importantly, her father surprised everyone by supporting the project. "My daughter knows both ships and people," he told skeptical officials. "If she says this can work, I believe her." The first converted ship launched 3 months after the earthquake. Keela had insisted on calling it a floating neighborhood, rather than a temporary shelter. The difference in language reflected a difference in approach. Instead of just providing beds and meals, the ship was designed as a healing community. Families were not just assigned rooms randomly. They were placed near others who could provide mutual support. Former teachers were grouped with families that had school-aged children. People with medical experience were positioned to help elderly residents. The ship included workshop spaces where people could learn new skills or practice trades they already knew. There were gardens on deck where families could grow vegetables and flowers. Most importantly, there were common areas designed to encourage interaction and community building. But the real test came when conflicts arose, as they inevitably did. Living in close quarters on a ship was stressful. People had different ideas about noise levels, cooking smells, and use of shared spaces. Cultural differences that had been manageable in the neighborhood hubs became more intense when families could not easily get away from each other. Traditional approaches might have involved setting strict rules and hiring security guards to enforce them, but Keela applied her community building principles instead. She helped residents form self-governance committees that included representatives from different age groups and backgrounds. When conflicts arose, the committees used mediation techniques she had learned from her psychology studies. Instead of punishment, the focus was on understanding and problem-solving. The approach was not always smooth. There were heated arguments and tense meetings. Some families chose to leave the ship for other housing options. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The floating neighborhood started functioning like a real community. Neighbors looked out for each other's children. People shared meals and celebrated holidays together. Elderly residents found purpose in teaching traditional crafts to younger generations. Most surprisingly, mental health outcomes were better than in traditional emergency housing. Psychologists who studied the ship community found lower rates of depression and anxiety. Among residents, children showed fewer signs of trauma-related stress. The success attracted international attention. Disaster relief organizations from around the world sent observers to study the floating neighborhoods. Urban planners wanted to understand how the design principles could be applied to land-based communities. But for Kula, the most meaningful validation came from the residents themselves. At the 6-month mark, the ship community held a celebration to honor their progress. Ahmad, now a respected elder on the ship, stood up to speak. "When I first came to Japan as a refugee," he said, "I felt like I was drowning in a strange ocean. This ship has been like a lifeboat that helped me remember how to swim." His words captured what Keela had been trying to achieve all along. She was not just building floating housing. She was building vessels that could carry people safely through the storms of displacement and trauma. But the ultimate test was still coming. After a year, residents would need to transition back to permanent housing on land. Would the community connections they had built survive that transition? Or would the floating neighborhoods turn out to be just another temporary solution to permanent problems? As Keela watched children playing on the ship's deck while their parents prepared dinner in the communal kitchens, she felt cautiously optimistic. They had proven that her ideas could work under pressure. The real question was whether they could work in the long term. 2 years after the earthquake, Keela stood once again at the edge of Yokohama shipyard, but this time she was not alone. Beside her stood Maria, who had become more than just a marine biologist friend. She was now a partner in designing ships that worked with ocean ecosystems instead of against them. Next to Maria stood Ahmad, who had used his carpentry skills to help design the interior spaces of 3 different floating communities. His granddaughter was there too, now 13, and fluent in Japanese, English, and her family's native language. But the biggest surprise was her father. The man who had once worried about her abandoning the family tradition was now the biggest supporter of what the media had started calling humanitarian shipbuilding. The ship they were watching launch that morning looked like no cargo vessel ever built before. From the outside, it appeared to be a normal container ship, but hidden within its design were features that made it ready to transform into emergency housing within hours of arriving at a disaster zone. The cargo holds were engineered with removable panels that could create family living spaces. The deck areas included pre-installed plumbing and electrical systems for community kitchens and gathering areas. Most importantly, the entire layout was designed using principles of community psychology that Keela had spent years learning and testing. "She is beautiful," her father said, watching the ship slide into Tokyo Bay. "Your great-grandfather would be amazed to see what our family business has become." The transformation had not been easy. Traditional shipping companies were skeptical about adding humanitarian features that increased construction costs. Some maritime engineers questioned whether ships designed for dual purposes could perform either function well, but the floating neighborhoods created after the earthquake had provided powerful evidence that the concept worked. All 3 ships were still operating as thriving communities. More importantly, when residents finally transitioned to permanent housing, they had maintained the social connections formed during their time at sea. The success had attracted attention from around the world. The United Nations had funded construction of 2 more humanitarian ships. Several coastal cities prone to natural disasters had pre-ordered vessels for their emergency response plans. Keela had also been invited to apply her methods in refugee camps and post-conflict zones internationally. Each project taught her something new about how people could support each other during difficult times. But perhaps the most significant change was happening within the traditional shipbuilding industry itself. Her father's company had started incorporating community-focused design features into all their vessels, not just the humanitarian ships. Cargo ships now included better crew facilities, designed to reduce isolation and depression during long voyages. Passenger ferries featured common areas that encouraged positive interactions between travelers from different backgrounds. Even oil tankers had improved living quarters that helped multinational crews work together more effectively. "You have taught us something important," her father told her as they watched the new ship's maiden voyage. "We always focused on moving things efficiently across the ocean. But we forgot that the most important cargo is often the people." The insight had led to innovations neither of them had expected. Working with Maria's environmental research, they had developed shipping routes that avoided whale migration paths during critical seasons. They had designed ship engines that produced less underwater noise pollution. They had even created partnerships with fishing communities to share ocean monitoring data. Ahmed had played a crucial role in many of these developments. His traditional building techniques, adapted for ship construction, had improved both the functionality and comfort of crew quarters. More importantly, his perspective as someone who had experienced displacement had helped them understand what people really needed during times of crisis. The floating neighborhoods had evolved into something unique in the world of disaster response. Instead of temporary shelters that people escaped from as quickly as possible, they had become launching platforms for new lives. Residents did not just receive services on the ships, they provided services to each other and to the broader community. Teachers who had been refugees became instructors for local children. Doctors and nurses who had fled their home countries found ways to practice their professions again. Engineers and craftspeople like Ahmad shared their knowledge with Japanese students and apprentices. The ships had become bridges between cultures and communities in ways no one had planned. Keela's work had also attracted attention from urban planners dealing with housing challenges in major cities. The community building principles she had developed for ships were being applied to apartment complexes, neighborhood revitalization projects, and even corporate office designs. A technology company in Singapore had hired her to redesign their headquarters using floating neighborhood principles. Instead of traditional office floors separated by department, they created collaborative spaces where different teams could interact naturally. The result was increased innovation and employee satisfaction. A housing project in Amsterdam had adapted her design concepts for low-income families from diverse backgrounds. By carefully planning shared spaces and community activities, they had created a model for integration that was being copied across Europe. But for Keela, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The International Maritime Organization invited her to speak at their annual conference about the future of shipping. Standing before an audience of ship designers, port authorities, and maritime officials from around the world, Keela felt nervous. These were people who measured success in tonnage and efficiency ratings. How could she explain what she had learned about the human side of ocean transportation? She decided to start with a story about her great-grandfather. Nearly a century ago, she began, "My great-grandfather built his first fishing boat with nothing but hand tools and determination. He did not just build a vessel to catch fish, he built a foundation for his family's future and a way to feed his community." She explained how each generation of her family had expanded that vision. Her grandfather had helped rebuild Japan's connection to the world after the war. Her father had built ships that carried goods and dreams across vast oceans. "But I realized we were missing something important," she continued. "We were so focused on the efficiency of moving cargo that we forgot ships also carry people. And people carry stories, hopes, fears, and the need for connection." She showed photos of the floating neighborhoods, but also of regular cargo ships. With improved crew facilities, she shared data about reduced accidents and improved crew retention when ships were designed with human psychology in mind. "The ocean connects all continents," she concluded, "but only if we design our vessels to honor both the efficiency of engineering and the complexity of human experience." The response was overwhelming. Port authorities wanted to know how to apply her principles to dock worker facilities. Cruise line executives asked about improving passenger experience through better community design. Even naval architects began incorporating psychological factors into their vessel specifications. 6 months later, Keela received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a young engineer in Brazil who had heard her conference presentation online. "I am writing to thank you for showing me that engineering can be about more than just solving technical problems," the letter said. "I am now working on designs for river transport ships that will serve remote communities in the Amazon. Your floating neighborhood concept is inspiring our approach to bringing not just transportation, but community services and connections to isolated villages." Reading that letter, Keela realized her experiment had succeeded in ways she never could have imagined. She had not abandoned her family's tradition of shipbuilding, she had expanded it. Ships had always been about crossing distances, but she had learned that the most important distances were not just physical, they were the emotional and social distances that separated people from each other. As she stood in the shipyard that evening, watching the lights of vessels moving across Tokyo Bay, Keela thought about all the different kinds of navigation happening around her. Ships were navigating between ports, carrying cargo that connected economies and cultures. But there was another kind of navigation happening too. On the floating neighborhoods anchored nearby, families were navigating the journey from displacement to belonging. In the refugee communities throughout the city, people were navigating between their past and their future. And in her own life, she had navigated from building vessels that crossed oceans to building connections that crossed the spaces between human hearts. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, who was on a research vessel studying whale populations in the Pacific. The migration patterns are stabilizing, the message read. Fewer ship strikes this season thanks to the new shipping routes. The whales and the cargo ships are learning to share the ocean. Keela smiled as she typed back her response. Same thing happening with people on land. We are all learning to share the same waters. As she walked home through the streets of Tokyo, Keela reflected on how much had changed since that first conversation with Maria about whales and ships. She hated